Welcome to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and today we're going to be talking about fair housing here in Fairfax County. And joining me is Margaret Squires. She is with the Fairfax County Office of Human Rights and Equity Programs. Thank you so much for being here, Margaret.
Thank you.
So, fair housing is one part of the programs under this particular agency, but you are tasked with investigating complaints when people believe they've been discriminated against.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people, myself included until recently, didn't know that such an agency existed or that you and your colleagues existed to investigate these claims of discrimination. So I'm hoping you can share with our viewers, first of all, what kinds of discriminations and what people are in protected classes, and offer some advice for how people can access if they believe they've been a victim of discrimination.
Okay, well, we receive and investigate complaints in 5 different programs: housing, which I'm going to talk about today, employment, public accommodations, credit, and private education. The protected classes include race, color, national origin, sex, religion, familial status, that's housing only, that's children under age 8, families with children under age 18, and disability, both mental and physical. Employment, I believe, also has genetic information, and also marital status is covered. And that's for generally. In housing, it is race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, families with children, disability, elderliness, which means 55 and older. That's a state law, so we cover it. Marital status as well.
So you mentioned something just now about state law. So there are federal protections to a degree.
Yes.
There are certain things at the state level that the legislature has addressed, but the department you work for is specific to Fairfax County.
Yes.
So what are some of the kinds of complaints that your office deals with, and how can people access these services if they believe that they are a victim of discrimination? What are some of those kinds of discrimination?
Okay, for example, under disability, people with disability have additional protections. They can ask for something called a reasonable accommodation or a reasonable modification. An accommodation would be a change in a policy or a service or a procedure that, for example, no pets are allowed. You're in a multifamily or housing situation and no pets are allowed. Then if you have a visual impairment, then you could ask to have a service animal. And if they do allow pets and you need a service animal, because that service animal is not considered a pet, you do not have to pay a pet fee.
Ah, see, now that's not something I would have known either right off the bat. And for as far as service animals, now there's service animals for all kinds of other disabilities. We were accustomed to seeing eye dogs. That's what they used to be called. Blind people had seeing eye dogs. But now people with some kinds of, mental health issues or other kinds of issues also have service animals. So
they're called emotional support animals,
right.
Assistance animals.
Right. Okay. And are those assistance animals covered, or is that a distinction that is different from a service animal?
No, they are all covered. They do not have to be trained like in employment. They do not have, but they have to. You have to show, if you request an accommodation like that, you have to show why it is needed. That you, first of all, that you have a disability, you are a member of what we call a protected class, that why you need that service animal. If it's obvious, if it's visual impairment, or it's or you're requesting something, a door to be widened or something because you're in a wheelchair. If it's very obvious, then the housing provider cannot ask you to provide proof or medical records or anything like that. In fact, they cannot ask for your medical records, just something from someone who's in a position to know that you have this disability. If it's obvious, they're not required, they're not supposed to ask for that. If it's not obvious, they can ask for that, some kind of verification that you do in fact have a disability. They can't ask for details or your medical records or anything like that, but somebody in a position like a physician or somebody like that, and show that you need this particular accommodation in order to be able to access and use the housing, just like other people in the complex or wherever.
So you have a phone number that people can call, and it also includes a TTY number for
Yes.
people who have
Hearing
disabilities,
impairment.
that people can go online if they want to file a complaint, and there's a form there online.
Yeah, I should explain that. They can call our office and somebody will put them through to somebody to find out what's going on. They can walk into the office between 8 and 4:30, Monday through Friday, or they can go online. When they go online and they fill out that form, they are not actually filing a complaint. They are putting information, and somebody usually within 24 hours of a business day will call them and speak to them and get the information, and then we'll prepare a complaint and they'll sign it. And that complaint begins on the day of the signature of that complaint, or when we actually file the complaint. They only have 365 days to file a complaint with Fairfax County, where we will receive the complaint, look whether or not it does rise to a fair housing complaint, and investigate it. And our services are free of charge. We don't charge anything there. It's a service, a government service. If they get 2 years if they go to a private attorney. But if they go to a private attorney, we're out of it. If we start an investigation and we collect information and then they decide to go to a private attorney, we'll have them withdraw their complaint, and any information that we have collected will not be available. So
Okay,
that
so it's
attorney,
not available.
they'd have to, the attorney has to
do all of that discovery themselves.
And that's so that people are not just using us to.
Right.
Yes.
So basically you're triaging the calls or the people as they come in, or they call, or they register a complaint online. And explain a little bit about how you triage that and decide what next steps are appropriate.
Okay, we'll look at the complaint. We'll probably look at who, when, what, where. We'll look at if this person, whatever they're alleging, that they're a member of a protected class and it would be covered. That it's at a property for fair housing within Fairfax County, so it's jurisdictional, it's our jurisdiction. When it occurred, if it occurred within the last 365 days, and what occurred, and if what they're saying is true, would that violate fair housing laws? So we're looking at those 4 things. And then we go from there, and yes, this meets all our requirements. We will then go and initiate the process that goes through, accept the complaint as a fair housing complaint, and start going through the process, which includes contacting the respondent. We call the respondent, that's the person who's been allegedly violated the fair housing laws. We'll send them a letter and with the information, and we'll give them 10 days from receipt of that letter to respond to us. And then we will try to conciliate. We'll try to get the parties together. It's not mandatory, but if both parties we try to get both parties to come together so that we can maybe come to some resolution that works for both sides. And if that happens, the conciliation agreement will be signed, and that's the end of it. Basically, for us, we might follow up if there are any conditions to that, and make sure that they are taken care of. For example, we usually put in there that somebody has to go agree to fair housing training. The person who is believed to have violated the fair housing laws, and we'll conduct that free of charge. And then, if they can't get together on that, we'll continue the investigation. If we find that it doesn't rise to the level of, there's reason to believe that this was discrimination, we will close the case. If we do feel that it is a cause case, that it does rise to that level, then we will attempt another conciliation agreement. And often that will do it. But then if that doesn't, then it goes up to the county attorney's office, to our Human Rights Commission, then the county attorney's office, and they will take it to court.
Right.
And they will act on behalf of the complainant.
And that's a pretty serious, by this time you've exhausted every other avenue by the time it goes to the county attorney's office. But again, this is a resource for people who might not otherwise have the resources to hire an attorney.
Yeah.
Or to have this investigated without the county stepping in. What about in cases where you find that it's not within the jurisdiction? Are there other agencies that you work with
Yeah, well, if it's not within Fairfax County, or if it's, I should note that we are dealing with private residential housing.
Right.
We don't deal with public housing. In that case, that goes to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and we would refer people to them. If it's private residential housing and it's located in Fairfax County, we would accept it. If we found out, which we sometimes do, it's Prince William County or it's Alexandria or something like that, we will refer them to those agencies. If it's not really a fair housing issue, it might be, say, a landlord-tenant issue, we will refer them to Consumer Affairs, Fairfax County Consumer Affairs. If it's something to do with properties that Fairfax County manages and holds, we will probably refer them to the Department of Community Housing and Community Development, Fairfax County Housing. If it has to do with immigration issues, but it's not really a fair housing issue, we will refer people to one of the local advocates like Legal Services of Northern Virginia or some other group that deals with those issues. If it's, homeless situation, we've got a Department of Homelessness
Right.
that deals with. So there are a lot of different, we can refer people, and sometimes they get referred to us. Somebody might have gone to Consumer Affairs, and Consumer Affairs feels that this is a discrimination issue, and they will refer the call to us. So there are lots of agencies within the county, Family Services and others that can help people. And we're dealing primarily with issues related to discrimination based on somebody's protected class.
Well, yes, and some people may not know which bucket they fall into, and it's a massive, Fairfax County government is massive, because the county is massive. There's over 1 million people here. And so people might go through one doorway or another doorway, but generally the referrals are made efficiently to get people to the right place.
Yeah, and if people Google, go onto the website, the county's website, and put in housing, they'll very quickly get to either or housing very quickly. So if they do housing discrimination, they'll be, but they should call us directly.
Right. So. Right, and it's good that you have a phone number, and the phone number, a lot of people would prefer to talk to a person and explain the situation before you either go in person or fill out the form online.
Yeah.
So, and that's very good advice. So before we go to our break, I just want to say stay tuned for our next segment. We are going to be talking further with Margaret Squires of the Fairfax County Office of Human Rights and Equity Programs, specifically about fair housing here in Fairfax County. So join us after the break.
My twin brother Jacob has an autism spectrum disorder. I remember one moment after being at school all day, I remember him getting into the car just bawling and saying, "Mom, I have no friends. Why don't I have any friends?" It broke my heart. That was the moment when I realized that I needed to do something about this. I needed to make a difference in his life. And I knew that if I could help him find a friend, I could help teach other people that including people with differences is the right thing to do. That was the inspiration behind my nonprofit, Score a Friend. Educating people to include people with differences is so important, because when Jacob's included, he feels like he can succeed in life and he feels like he actually has a purpose.
Queen is just my everything.
His smile did it. His smile, his eyes, his knowledge. My landlord, he decided that he wanted me to move based on the fact that I was transgender. Let's just respect people in everyday life for just being human.
So, I'm kind of new here, but I've noticed a trend. My human does this funny thing where she goes around and gets all my toys, and then she hides them in that basket by the door. But it's always the same basket, and it's always in the same place. And then she acts so surprised when I find them, but, she's putting them in the same basket. Again. It's like, hello, that's where you put it last time. You were the worst at hide and go seek.
Welcome back to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and today we're talking about fair housing with Margaret Squires, who is with the Fairfax County Office of Human Rights and Equity Programs. Thank you for being here, Margaret.
Thank you.
So we were talking about the kinds of complaints that come to your office to investigate. Explain a little bit about the kinds of housing we're talking about.
Okay, we're talking about private residential housing, primarily multifamily housing. That means more than 4 units, and lots of other types of housing, senior housing, group homes, things like that, elderly housing. There are a few exceptions that do not fall under the fair housing laws. There are buildings, it's called the Mrs. Murphy Law, buildings with 4 units or less in which the owner lives in and maintains one of those units, and some single family housing that is rented or rented out that might be, they're usually just a few houses, I think less than 3 housings. They are exempted from fair housing laws. However, there is a caveat to that. If they use a broker to advertise at their rental units or whatever, or sales, whatever, they then lose the exemption, because then they're now going into the professional field. And also, if they advertise in a discriminatory manner, if they put an advertisement out, like even though they're an exempt property, they're less than 4 units, etc. If they say no children or something like that, their exemption is no longer exists. Okay, so they lose that exemption. And a discriminatory statement is not just a written statement, it is a verbal statement. So some people think, oh no, I'm not covered. But they wrote in an email, or they put in the newspaper, or they said something that said, no, I don't want any kids, I don't want anybody who's disabled. We've had people say they don't want vets because they get PTSD, they might have PTSD, things like that.
Really?
Yes. So they cannot, if they make a discriminatory statement, or they use a broker, or they go to a professional to rent, then they lose their exemption status.
Wow, so some people probably don't even know if they've been victims of discrimination. It might not be apparent, but there probably are some clues. I think you had mentioned when someone sells, no, we found a tenant, and yet you still see the listing out there.
Yes.
And you might think to yourself, well, they told me they had somebody, but it seems like they're still trying to find a tenant. That might be a clue that they're the victims of some type of discriminatory.
Yes. That's a clue. That red flag, as we call it. The property is advertised, they call up about it, they're told in a very nice manner, no, it's been rented, and then we've had a friend call back, and it's not clear maybe from their voice that they are of a certain background, and then they say, oh yeah, it's available. And we've also done some testing in those areas as well. So a lot of the times people don't. That is a red flag. Sometimes if your gut feeling tells you to, if you, a lot of the discrimination is more subtle. Somebody will be more encouraged. There'll be inducements for them. They'll say, well, we'll waive this fee or we'll waive that fee, but they might not tell another person who's going
right.
there that they don't. And if they know that sometimes these places do waive fees and things like that, and they can check it out, that's another red flag. So
it is very interesting, and I think we've seen a drop in all over the county in the number of immigrants coming forward with all kinds of complaints, because there's just this fraught environment right now where people who, especially Hispanic people, feel like they're putting themselves and their families in jeopardy. Have you seen a drop-off?
We have seen a drop-off of complaints from the Hispanic community and the immigrant community, and we do think that may be the issue, and that's because we've actually talked to people who have sometimes when they've called up for information, and we ask them if they'd like to file a complaint, and it appears that they maybe do have an issue, and they'll say, no, I'm just really calling, and they don't want to come into a government office. They're afraid. So we've had some situations that were brought to our attention, and then we find out that they don't want to go ahead with it, and that has to do with them just feeling uncomfortable, even if they are not undocumented.
Right.
There's this atmosphere out there where people are a little leery and suspect of government.
Right.
So.
And when people have a complaint, you're not necessarily asking them for their documentation.
No.
We were talking a bit about how we've become this society where you're asked for your papers or your ID constantly, all the time, everywhere you go. It's like, show me your ID, show me your papers. And so you're not asking for people, you're just asking what their complaint is, and you're investigating it no matter who they are.
Yeah, and discrimination isn't just when you're applying for housing. It can be when you're within, it can be that certain groups are being given, their repairs are being done, their services are being done, and people notice that. They notice that. But in terms of applying for housing and what have you, we don't. We call, people call us, we take the information. It sounds like it's possible that they may be being discriminated against. We start to look into it. We don't ask them for, all we need is their name, the complaint, the alleged violation, that it's within the time frame that we're looking at. And we will go ahead and we'll accept it if it rises to the level of a fair housing complaint, and we'll investigate it.
But part of this too is because it's public information, somebody could FOIA it, and FOIA is Freedom of Information Act, and that's become now a verb. You can FOIA something and request the information if it's a matter of public record or...
Yeah, it is a matter of public record, some of these, so people could get access to those things. And it's not necessarily that they're going to, but people are so afraid right now that they maybe don't want to put themselves out there. I should mention too that there is, the fair housing laws cover retaliation for filing a fair housing complaint. Some people are afraid because they think, well, if I file a complaint, then the housing provider will evict me or do something like that. And we've had several retaliation complaints in the past year. It is actually illegal for somebody who has been a respondent in a fair housing complaint, even if we find out that the complaint, we don't find merit.
Right.
They cannot retaliate. They think they can. They're angry that a complaint was filed against them. We've absolved them of it. We've not found reasonable cause, and then they turn around and evict the person, and then they're
they are in trouble because now they have violated the law.
They are in serious trouble then, because the courts do not like that. They do not like the fact that that would stop people from filing complaints if they feel that that they can be retaliated against, and they cannot retaliate. That is a slam dunk almost for us if somebody retaliates and turns around and evicts somebody. Because they filed a complaint, or because they participated in a complaint. If we talk to neighbors, to see what kind of services they get, or things like that, or we try to verify some information, and because that person talked with us, they get retaliated against too. That is illegal under fair housing laws. So.
And that's really tough for Virginia, because Virginia is very much a property rights state, and there's very much a mentality around private property ownership and what you can do with your property and on your property. But this is very different if you're renting out property and you're an owner.
Yes.
But I think in Virginia, culturally, major problem with that. I do want to point out to folks too that you and your colleagues are available to go and actually explain this to groups. Faith organizations, service clubs, nonprofits who deal with vulnerable populations or marginalized populations of people who might be more likely to be at this end of the discriminatory practice.
Yeah.
How would people engage someone from your department to come out?
They just would call us, and we're happy to come out. We don't charge anything. We also go out to nonprofits who are housing, who are housing providers themselves, and train their staff about fair housing laws so that they understand what they can and cannot do, as well as the clients that nonprofits and others have. We are, like you've mentioned, faith groups, multicultural groups, different organizations, to explain those rights and the process and what have you. And we do not charge for that.
So we didn't even talk about that. There's a lot of transitional housing in the county, both that run and operated by nonprofits and some operated by the county themselves. But are there exemptions among that?
No, they
housing?
are covered under fair housing laws, and we will investigate sometimes. Like county properties, we would not, because we have a conflict of interest there. That would go to HUD.
Right.
Others, we have shelters. Sometimes
Right.
they're private and what have you. We have investigated there. Those shelters are covered under Fair Housing Act. Transitional housing is covered under the Fair Housing Act. It's usually not that much of an issue, but there are issues that do come up. A lot have to do with disability, and a lot of those organizations don't realize that they are covered, and we do try to reach out to them and give them information so that they know what they can and they cannot do, and they often call us too for information and for resources into, I mean, we don't give legal advice. We have attorneys on our staff, but we do not give legal advice because we don't know the situation when they call. We answer a question pertinent to the particular issue that they mention, maybe refer them to a resource, maybe give them some materials and answer questions. But we don't technically give legal advice because there may be something going on that we don't know about. So.
Right, and when we talk about disability, I think most people are thinking wheelchairs, ramps. You talk about accommodation. We've talked about service animals, but there are other kinds of disabilities. There are people with learning disabilities. There are people who are looking for housing, who are supported, who might be struggling with mental illness. You mentioned vets. I hadn't even thought of veterans who might have PTSD. These are all sort of invisible disabilities.
Yeah, veterans are not a protected class, but they are protected under disability laws sometimes because perceived. I should mention that you don't just have a disability if you are perceived to have one. I used that years ago. That was a problem with AIDS. People were assumed because maybe they were their sexual orientation or something else, that maybe they had AIDS, and we've kind of gotten over that. But with the vets, they are coming back with physical disabilities and some emotional disabilities, but most of them are coming back and they're not a risk.
Right.
But they're being lumped. And so if you are perceived to have a disability, or that you might have a disability, and you are discriminated against based on that, even though you don't have a disability, you still are protected under fair housing laws.
Well, the last thing I'm going to mention before we close the show is there are people who are not covered, and that is the LGBT community. People who are in same-sex marriages and who are transgender are not covered under the county, under the state law, and that is something that we hope to change this year. Thank you so much for being here, Margaret. I hope our viewers at home have learned a little bit more about the resources you have here if you think you've been the victim of housing discrimination here in Fairfax County. And this is what you need to know.